When the temperature dropped to 38 degrees below zero and frozen pine trees began exploding like rifle shots across the valley, a 36-year-old widow was sleeping comfortably in a cotton nightgown, without a fire burning in her stove. To the people living in the Flathead Valley of Montana Territory in the late autumn of 1952, that statement would have sounded like complete madness. In a mountain basin where winter was not merely a season, but a 4-month battle against physical extinction, staying warm required relentless physical labor. It meant cutting cords of larch and fir until your back seared with pain, hauling heavy logs through thigh-deep drifts, and waking up every 2 hours through the dead of night to stoke glowing iron stoves. Yet, while her neighbors burned through entire woodpiles just to keep their wash basins from freezing solid indoors, Clara Vance sat quietly in an environment that held a steady 68 degrees, using less than 30% of the fuel anyone else consumed. Before we look at the extraordinary secret beneath her floorboards, take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from and what is the coldest winter you have ever had to endure. We read every single comment, and your stories help us bring these forgotten frontier victories back to life. Clara Vance had arrived in the Flathead Valley in late August 1952, driving a single battered freight wagon loaded with basic hand tools, 2 trunks of clothing, and a crate of worn medical textbooks inherited from her late father, an army surgeon. Her husband, Thomas, had been killed 18 months earlier in a timber camp accident along the Pacific coast, leaving Clara with a modest settlement check and a fierce, uncompromising drive to secure her own independence. She was a lean, deliberate woman with quiet gray eyes and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. She did not look like someone who intended to fail, but she certainly did not fit the valley's idea of a sensible homesteader. When she purchased a 5-acre parcel at the far edge of the tree line, local land speculators chuckled. The lot sat directly against the shadowed, rocky slope of a northeast ridge. It was a site that experienced builders actively avoided, because it was completely cut off from direct winter sunlight by mid-afternoon. To the men who had spent their lives building traditional notch-and-chink log homes, Clara's choice of land looked like a beginner's mistake. But Clara had not chosen the site for the sun above it. She had chosen it because of the dense, undisturbed rock outcroppings and deep clay subsoil resting beneath it. She spent her first 3 days in the valley simply walking the perimeter of her property. She carried a long iron pry bar and an auger, driving them into the soil at various points, testing the depth of the topsoil, observing the natural slope of the terrain, and asking the few local residents she met about the depth of the local water table and the historical reach of the winter frost line. She was reading the landscape with the careful eye of a master builder, though at the time, everyone who passed by her lot simply thought she was a confused outsider, wasting precious daylight before the autumn rains set in. In the second week of September, while the golden leaves of the mountain aspens were still fluttering in the crisp autumn breeze, Clara Vance began to build. But she did not begin by felling trees for logs, nor did she order stone for a foundation stem wall. Instead, she stepped out onto the flat ground near the base of the ridge with a mattock, a short-handled spade, and a pair of heavy leather work gloves, and she began to dig. She did not dig a shallow trench for timber footings. She marked out a large rectangle measuring 14 feet wide by 20 feet long, and she began removing the earth entirely, bucket by heavy bucket. It did not take long for the neighbors to notice. The main wagon trail ran less than 200 yards from her property line, and by her 4th day of digging, her progress had become the chief topic of conversation at the local mill and general store. Thad Miller, the prosperous owner of the local timber mill, and a man who prided himself on knowing everything worth knowing about construction in Montana, stopped his wagon along the road one Tuesday morning. Sitting beside him was Arthur Brooks, the valley's most respected master carpenter, a man who had framed over 30 log homes across the territory. The 2 men watched, in utter disbelief, as Clara hauled out another wooden bucket packed with 40 pounds of stiff gray clay, dumping it onto a growing earth embankment along the north side of the pit. Thad climbed down from his wagon, adjusted his heavy wool coat, and walked over to the edge of the excavation. He looked down at Clara, who was standing waist-deep in the earth, her shirt stained with sweat and yellow dirt. He asked her if she realized that winter was less than 2 months away, pointing out that digging a hole in the ground was no way to get a roof over her head before the snow started falling. Clara paused, wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, and looked up at him calmly. She did not offer a long explanation, nor did she attempt to justify her work to a man who had already made up his mind. She simply replied that she was making steady progress, and asked Thad if he happened to know the maximum depth the frost had reached during the severe freeze of 1936. Thad laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried across the open clearing. He told her that frost went 4 feet deep when the ground froze hard, and warned her that if she kept digging down like that, her dirt walls would cave in and bury her the moment the autumn rains saturated the soil. Arthur Brooks joined him at the edge of the pit, shaking his head with a look of genuine pity. Arthur told her that timber was cheap, logs were abundant, and that any proper home needed to sit up on solid ground where air could circulate, not down in a dark ditch like an oversized root cellar. They warned her that living in a hole would leave her damp, miserable, and sick with lung fever before Christmas. Clara listened to their advice politely, nodded her head, and then picked up her mattock and swung it back down into the hard clay. Day after day, she continued her grueling physical labor, working from first light until the stars appeared over the dark ridge of the mountain. She manually excavated more than 15 tons of soil and gravel. She moved every single pound by hand, building up a massive, sloped earth barrier along the north and west sides of the pit, the exact directions from which the fierce winter winds swept down the valley. To the townspeople who watched her progress, it looked like the desperate, misguided struggle of a lonely woman who was too proud to ask for help, building a monument to her own ignorance. If the sight of Clara digging a massive pit in the ground had amused the valley, the arrival of her building materials in early October turned their amusement into open hilarity. On a cold, overcast Thursday morning, a heavy flatbed freight wagon pulled up to Clara's property. Stacked on the back were crates of war surplus, galvanized steel Quonset hut arches, corrugated metal panels that the military had sold off by the thousands after the war. Clara had purchased the entire assembly from an army depot in Great Falls for just $80. Within hours, news of the delivery had spread through the settlement. Men gathered at the general store, leaning against the counter and laughing about the woman at the tree line who was planning to live in a tin grain bin. Thad Miller was at the center of the crowd, gleefully explaining the physical impossibility of what Clara was attempting. He pointed out to everyone listening that corrugated steel was one of the worst building materials ever devised for a cold climate. Metal conducts heat away from a room almost instantly. Touch cold steel in the middle of a Montana winter, and your skin will stick to it. In an uninsulated metal hut, the warmth from a stove escapes through the shell as fast as you can burn the wood, while the moisture from human breath condenses on the interior ceiling, forming thick sheets of frost that melt and drip down like ice water whenever the fire gets hot. To make matters worse, several neighbors who had walked past her property over the weekend reported another shocking detail. The structure she was assembling over her dirt pit had no exterior stone chimney, no large windows along the north or west sides, and absolutely no interior framing for a bedroom. Arthur Brooks declared publicly that he had examined the site from the road, and it was clear she had built nothing more than a crude 16 by 20-foot storage shed with a curved metal roof. There were no interior partition walls, no sleeping loft, and no insulation visible anywhere. It was a single, open, cold metal arch sitting half-sunk over a dirt hole. Thad Miller went so far as to make a public wager at the mill, declaring that Clara Vance would either abandon her metal tin can before the 1st of February or end up being hauled into town with severe frostbite. He argued that it was an insult to the hard-working pioneers of the valley for an outsider to come in and try to survive a Montana winter inside an uninsulated piece of scrap metal, ignoring 80 years of proven log cabin tradition. Clara, however, paid no attention to the gossip circulating in town. She worked methodically through the crisp October days, bolting the arched corrugated steel panels together overhead. She used a heavy socket wrench, tightening every galvanized bolt until the curved ribs formed an unbroken, weather-tight shell spanning directly across her excavation. When the last steel arch was secured in place, the structure looked completely alien against the rustic mountain backdrop. It was a rounded silver-gray hump, sitting pressed against the base of the dark mountain ridge, half surrounded by the massive earthen mounds she had dug from the earth. To anyone driving a wagon past her gate, it looked completely unfinished, utterly lacking in basic comfort, and thoroughly bizarre. It looked like a building that had no warmth, no style, and most importantly, no place for a human being to sleep. But behind the closed canvas entry doors of that metal shell, Clara was finishing an interior design that no one in the Flathead Valley had the imagination to foresee. What the people of the Flathead Valley failed to realize was that Clara Vance had not simply dug a hole. She had executed a carefully calculated earth-sheltered excavation that reached a total depth of 8.5 feet below the natural surface grade. In a region where the winter frost line rarely penetrated beyond 4 feet, her excavation extended far down into a geological layer that the freezing surface temperatures could never touch. Reaching that depth had required immense physical endurance. Beneath the top 18 inches of rich forest loam lay a dense, stubborn layer of compacted gray clay intermixed with glacial river gravel. Clara had worked her way through it inch by inch. Whenever she struck heavy granite boulders embedded in the clay, she used her iron pry bar to lever them out, rolling them into the corners of her pit to serve as structural corner anchors, rather than hauling them up to the surface. Once she reached the 8.5-foot mark, she encountered solid, impervious shale bedrock. Instead of fighting it, she used it as her natural foundation floor. To ensure that ground moisture would never accumulate in her subterranean living space, she constructed a traditional French drain system along the entire perimeter of the bedrock floor. Using a heavy sledgehammer, she cracked the edges of the shale to create a subtle drainage slope, lined the channel with coarse river gravel she had hauled up from the creek bed in buckets, and directed the flow toward a natural fissure in the rock face that carried water safely away from her living footprint. Next came the structural shoring. Clara understood that unreinforced dirt walls would eventually slough off or collapse if moisture managed to penetrate behind them during the spring thaw. To prevent this, she harvested thick, 8-inch Douglas fir timbers from the dense woods along the back of her property. She hand-peeled the bark from each log to prevent rot and insect infestation, then set 4 heavy corner posts upright directly onto the shale floor, notching them securely into the bedrock. Between these vertical posts, she built a heavy timber retaining wall, using rough-cut 2-inch pine planks. She placed these planks horizontally against the vertical earth faces, leaving a 2-inch gap between the wood and the raw clay wall. She packed this 2-inch cavity tightly with dry crushed limestone and wood ash. This created a dual-purpose barrier. It provided structural resistance against the immense lateral pressure of the surrounding earth, while the alkaline limestone and ash mix acted as a natural repellent against insects, rodents, and mold. By the time the subterranean shoring was complete, she had created an underground timber and stone box that was structurally independent of the soil surrounding it. The floor was covered with a 4-inch bed of washed river gravel, thoroughly tamped down until it was flat and solid, then topped with hand-split fir planks raised 2 inches off the gravel on treated wooden sleepers. This created an insulated subfloor that allowed air to circulate underneath, ensuring that the walking surface would remain completely dry and warm underfoot, regardless of how much snow piled up on the world above. To appreciate why Clara's hidden chamber worked so remarkably well, one must understand the basic laws of thermodynamics and soil science principles that Clara had studied in her late father's natural philosophy books, but which her neighbors had completely overlooked in their rush to build above-ground timber cabins. The central scientific principle behind her subterranean room is a phenomenon known as thermal lag. When the summer sun beats down on the surface of the Earth during July and August, the soil absorbs a massive amount of solar radiation. However, heat does not travel through dense earth quickly. Soil, clay, and rock have a high thermal mass, meaning they absorb energy slowly and conduct it even slower. Thermal energy travels downward through dense subsoil, in a slow, continuous wave, at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 feet per month. Therefore, the heat deposited into the surface soil by the blistering sun of mid-July does not reach a depth of 8 feet until late November or early December. While the surface world above is plunging into sub-zero winter temperatures, the soil surrounding an 8-foot-deep pit is actually reaching its peak annual warmth, slowly releasing the stored heat of the previous summer into the open cavity. Furthermore, at a depth of 8 feet below the surface, the Earth operates as a massive thermal battery with an essentially endless capacity. While the air temperature in Montana can swing wildly from 60 degrees above zero in October to 40 degrees below zero in January, the temperature of the deep subsoil remains almost entirely stable year-round, hovering between 45 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the raging blizzard blowing across the surface. This meant that Clara was not starting her heating process from 0 degrees or below, as her neighbors were in their elevated log cabins. She was starting from a baseline temperature of nearly 50 degrees, provided entirely free of charge by the Earth itself. To raise the temperature of a room from 50 degrees to a comfortable 68 degrees requires only a tiny fraction of the heat energy needed to raise a room from 20 below zero to 68 degrees. There was another critical geometric advantage to her subterranean design: the complete elimination of cold corners and convective drafts. In a standard rectangular log cabin built above ground, heat escapes rapidly through the vertical wall joints and corner notches. As the cold outdoor wind strikes the exterior corners, it creates localized pressure drops that suck warm air straight out through the smallest chinking gaps. At the same time, the cold interior log surfaces cause the air inside the room to cool, sink, and roll along the floor, creating continuous, freezing drafts at ankle height. In Clara's subterranean chamber, there were no exterior corners exposed to the wind. The massive earth walls surrounding her room on all four sides acted as a continuous, unbroken insulator. Because the surrounding ground was far warmer than the winter air outside, there were no extreme temperature differences along the walls to drive aggressive convective air currents. The air inside the room remained still, stable, and naturally stratified, allowing warmth to build up smoothly and remain suspended in the living space, rather than being stripped away by the mountain wind. Once the underground chamber was fully shored and timbered, Clara turned her attention to the interior wall treatment and the assembly of the upper structure. She knew that raw wood planking underground would eventually absorb ambient humidity if left untreated, so she mixed a traditional plaster using local clay, fine river sand, and chopped wheat straw. Working with a wooden trowel, she hand-applied a 2-inch layer of this plaster over every inch of the timber-lined walls. The straw provided fibrous tensile strength, preventing the plaster from cracking as it dried, while the clay and sand created a breathable, hygroscopic surface that could passively regulate interior humidity. When the air inside the chamber became moist from cooking or human respiration, the clay plaster would absorb the excess water vapor without losing its structural integrity. When the air grew dry, the clay would slowly release that moisture back into the room, maintaining a perfectly balanced indoor environment that prevented both damp mold and desert-dry respiratory irritation. Above this subterranean sanctuary, Clara erected the galvanized steel Quonset shell to serve a very specific structural purpose. She did not intend for the Quonset hut to be her primary living room. It was designed to function as a weather shield, a storage barn, and above all, a thermal airlock. She anchored the curved steel ribs directly to heavy timber plates set along the perimeter of the earth berm she had created during her digging. By placing the metal shell over the subterranean excavation, she created an unheated buffer zone directly overhead. The arched steel roof shed rain, wind, and snow effortlessly, while the air trapped inside the upper Quonset hut remained motionless. This unheated upper space acted exactly like the dead air gap between two panes of glass in a storm window, preventing the fierce prairie wind from ever making direct contact with the entrance hatch of her living room below. To connect the upper Quonset shell to the subterranean room, Clara built a heavy double-paneled timber hatch set flush with the fir floorboards of the upper hut. The hatch was lined around its entire perimeter with thick wool felt gaskets and filled internally with 6 inches of compressed, dry pine needles for insulation. When closed, it formed an airtight seal that completely separated the warm underground room from the cool upper storage shell. Leading down from the hatch into the hidden room below were 7 sturdy steps she had carved out of solid limestone blocks. In the far corner of the underground bedroom, she installed her small cast-iron camp stove, a tiny unit with a 4-inch firebox that required only a handful of kindling to produce a brisk heat. The slender stovepipe ran vertically from the stove, passed up through the floor hatch, crossed the open interior of the upper Quonset hut, and exited safely through a double-flashed collar in the curved metal roof. At the opposite end of the underground room, she constructed her bed, a heavy, hand-hewn fir frame raised 30 inches above the plank floor, keeping the mattress well within the warmest horizontal layer of air. Beneath the bed frame, she stacked cedar boxes filled with her winter clothing and dry food stores. By early November, while her neighbors were still hauling massive loads of cordwood to their cabins, Clara's hidden subterranean home was complete, completely invisible to anyone standing outside. The peaceful autumn weather broke abruptly on the afternoon of the 14th of December 1952. What had begun as a overcast, gray morning quickly transformed into the most violent meteorologic event the Flathead Valley had experienced in nearly 2 decades, a massive Arctic bomb cyclone dropping rapidly out of central Canada. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had turned a dark, bruised purple. The barometer plummeted at a rate that made old-timers check their instruments twice in disbelief. Then the wind arrived. It did not build gradually. It hit the valley like an atmospheric explosion, carrying sustained speeds of 45 miles per hour, with peak gusts exceeding 55 miles per hour. The roaring gale picked up the loose topsoil and powdery early snow, swirling them into a blinding wall of white that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet within minutes. Along with the wind came a catastrophic collapse in temperature. At noon, the thermometer outside the general store had read 22 degrees above zero. By 6 o'clock in the evening, it had plunged to 15 degrees below zero. By midnight, it hit 38 degrees below zero, with wind chill factors reaching an astonishing 65 below. The cold was so sudden and severe that it produced visceral, terrifying sounds across the wilderness. Moisture trapped inside the trunks of living pine and larch trees froze instantly, expanding with such immense pressure that the timber split open with loud, violent cracks that sounded like rifle fire echoing through the valley. In the barnyards, diesel fuel and tractor tanks turned into a thick, useless yellow gel, and unheated iron equipment became so brittle that striking a steel hitch with a hammer would cause the metal to shatter like glass. Out on the open flat near the tree line, the roaring wind struck Clara's Quonset shell broadside. But instead of slamming into flat, vertical log walls and tearing at chinked seams, the gale encountered a smooth, continuous arch. The aerodynamic curve of the corrugated steel shell allowed the howling wind to slide over and around the structure with minimal resistance. Snow carried by the storm hit the metal arch and slid down its steep, curved sides, rapidly building up a massive natural snowdrift along the north and west flanks of the building. Within 6 hours, the drift had swallowed the entire northern half of the Quonset hut, burying the metal shell under 6 feet of dense, powdery snow. To an uninformed observer, it looked as though the flimsy metal building was being crushed and destroyed by the elements. In reality, that massive snowdrift was providing a secondary outer blanket of insulation, adding an incredible layer of thermal protection over a structure that was already completely sheltered from the wind. While the snowdrift was quietly enveloping Clara's home, the rest of the Flathead Valley was plunging into a state of absolute survival crisis. In his large, expensive log home 2 miles down the road, Thad Miller was fighting a losing battle against the cold. His home had been built using traditional pioneer methods, heavy spruce logs notched at the corners and chinked with a mixture of lime, sand, and horsehair. Under normal winter conditions, the cabin was considered a model of frontier comfort. But in the face of a 38 below blast accompanied by a 50-mile-per-hour wind, the building's design limitations were exposed with brutal clarity. The howling wind battered the flat exterior log walls, creating massive pressure differentials that stripped heat from the wood faster than his two large stone fireplaces could produce it. Worse still, the extreme pressure forced freezing air straight through micro cracks in the mortar chinking. Inside Thad's living room, curtains blew inward away from the walls as if a window were wide open. By 2 o'clock in the morning, despite maintaining roaring fires in both hearths that consumed an entire armload of dry larch every 45 minutes, the indoor temperature in Thad's home had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, barely at the freezing point. Frost began coating the iron nails in the wall planks, and thick ice crystals formed on the inside of the glass window panes. His water bucket sitting on the kitchen table froze solid. Desperate to keep his wife and 3 young children warm, Thad was forced to abandon the bedrooms entirely. He dragged their mattresses into the main living room, arranging them in a tight circle directly in front of the stone hearth. By the 3rd day of the storm, his carefully stacked indoor firewood supply was completely exhausted. Attempting to reach his outdoor woodpile meant stepping out into a blinding, lethal blizzard, where the wind chill could cause frostbite on exposed skin in less than 2 minutes. When he finally managed to dig his way to the wood stack, he found that the wet autumn snow had frozen the logs into a solid, impenetrable block of ice. To keep his fireplaces burning, Thad was forced to chop up his wooden dining chairs, fence posts, and pine staging planks. A mile to the east, Arthur Brooks was facing a similar nightmare. The extreme cold caused the creosote inside his cabin's stone chimney to freeze and contract, cracking the mortar lining and blocking the draft. Smoke poured back into his living room, forcing his family to open the cabin door to clear the choking air, which instantly dropped the interior temperature to 16 degrees. Across the valley, livestock froze in their pens, pipes burst, and families huddled under mountain of wool quilts, praying for the storm to break before their fuel ran out entirely. 8 feet beneath the surface of the frozen earth, in the quiet chamber beneath the tree line, the reality was utterly different. While the wind screamed across the corrugated steel roof overhead with a sound like a jet engine, Clara Vance sat at a small fur table in her underground bedroom. She was wearing a simple cotton work shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, calmly sewing a tear in a canvas grain sack by the warm light of a single kerosene lamp. The silence in the room was absolute. The 8 feet of dense clay, gravel, and timber above her ceiling absorbed every vibration of the roaring gale, transforming the terrifying blizzard outside into a distant, muffled hum. At 7 o'clock that morning, when the storm outside was at its absolute peak and the surface temperature registered 38 below, Clara had opened the draft on her small iron camp stove and tossed in 4 small splits of dry pine, a total bundle of wood no larger than a man's forearm. The stove had burned briskly for 45 minutes, its iron top glowing a soft, dull red radiating heat into the compact room. The hand-applied clay plaster on the walls absorbed that sudden burst of thermal energy, while the earth surrounding the chamber maintained its steady, unyielding baseline warmth. When the 4 pine splits burned down to gray ash an hour later, Clara closed the stove damper completely. She did not add another stick of wood for the rest of the day. She did not need to. The room held a steady, unbroken temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. There were no cold drafts pulling across her floorboards. There was no frost forming in the corners, no ice in her water pitcher, and no moisture condensing on the timber ceiling. The clay and straw plaster on the walls maintained the indoor relative humidity at a comfortable 35%, absorbing the steam from her tea kettle and keeping the air feeling crisp, clean, and completely free of the choking wood smoke that was filling cabins across the valley. When bedtime arrived, Clara did not pile 6 heavy wool blankets over herself or sleep in her winter coat. She climbed onto her raised fur sleeping platform, pulled a single light quilt over her shoulders, and slept deeply and uninterrupted for 8 hours. Through the entire night, while her neighbors woke every hour in freezing homes to fight dying fires, Clara's room lost less than 2 degrees of heat. The endless thermal mass of the Montana earth held her chamber in an unyielding, protective embrace. She was not merely surviving the worst storm in 20 years. She was living in absolute, effortless comfort, supported by a fundamental law of physics that required neither wealth nor complex machinery to operate only the wisdom to build where the cold could never reach. On the fifth morning, the Arctic bomb cyclone finally broke. The howling wind died away to an absolute whisper, and the dense, blinding clouds cleared, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, blinding blue over a valley transformed into an Arctic wasteland. The snow lay 5 feet deep on the level, with drifts against buildings reaching 12 to 15 feet. The air was so cold that every breath taken outside produced a loud crackling sound as moisture froze instantly in the nostrils. Down at the mill, a group of exhausted, hollow-eyed men gathered in the clearing. Thad Miller, his hands wrapped in dirty rags to cover mild frostbite on his fingers, stood talking with Arthur Brooks and Henry Pollard, the county extension agent who had managed to strap on snowshoes and trek into the settlement from town to assess the damage. The report was grim. Dozens of head of cattle had been lost to the cold, 2 barns had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow, and nearly every family in the valley was out of dry firewood, exhausted, and dealing with frozen water supplies. As the men stood discussing emergency aid, Agent Pollard glanced up toward the northeast ridge. He pointed toward the edge of the tree line and asked if anyone had checked on the widow who lived in the metal hut. Thad Miller shook his head solemnly. He told Pollard that he hadn't seen a single wispy trail of smoke coming from that lot since the storm started 5 days ago. He pointed out that the Quonset hut was almost completely buried under a massive 10-foot snowdrift, and stated flatly that without an insulated timber structure or a massive stone fireplace, there was no chance a person could have survived 38 below inside a tin can. Arthur Brooks agreed, saying it was their duty as neighbors to snowshoe up to the property with shovels and retrieve her body. A heavy, somber mood fell over the group. The men felt a collective pang of guilt. Despite their earlier jokes and mockery, none of them had wanted to see the woman come to harm. They gathered 4 heavy shovels, strapped on their wooden snowshoes, and began the slow, grueling quarter-mile trek through deep powder toward the quiet metal hump at the base of the ridge. When they finally reached the property, the scene looked completely desolate. The Quonset hut was nearly invisible, buried beneath a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. There were no footprints in the snow, no sound from within, and no smoke issuing from the small vent pipe protruding through the metal roof. Thad Miller sighed, stepped up to the south face of the buried building, and began digging aggressively through the drift to clear a path to the canvas entry door, preparing himself for the grim task that lay inside. After 10 minutes of furious shoveling, Thad cleared a trench through the snowdrift and reached the timber frame of the Quonset's south entrance. He pulled back the heavy, stiffened canvas outer flap and stepped into the upper shell, with Agent Pollard and Arthur Brooks following closely behind him. The interior of the metal hut was exactly what they had expected: cold, dim, and unheated. The air inside held at roughly 20 degrees above zero, warmer than the freezing wilderness outside, but far too cold for human habitation. The metal walls were coated in a light dusting of frost, and the space was entirely empty, except for a few sacks of grain, a stack of split pine kindling, and a pair of snowshoes leaning against a post. Thad called out Clara's name, his voice echoing hollowly against the curved steel ceiling. There was no answer. He turned to Agent Pollard, shaking his head, and said they were too late. Then, from the far corner of the dark timber floor came a sharp, clear click. The 3 men froze. They watched in absolute astonishment as a square section of the fir floorboards pivoted upward on heavy iron hinges. Light and a sudden stream of warm air poured out from the floor opening. A moment later, Clara Vance appeared in the hatchway. She stepped up the stone stairs, wearing work trousers, leather boots, and a light flannel shirt with the collar open. Her hair was neatly combed, her skin was healthy and flushed with warmth, and she looked at the 3 heavy-coated, frost-covered men with an expression of mild surprise. She asked them if everything was all right down in the valley. Thad Miller stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at her as if he were looking at a ghost. He stammered out that they had come to check on her because they hadn't seen any smoke from her chimney for 5 days, and thought she had frozen to death inside the metal hut. Clara smiled faintly. She told them she was quite well, explaining that she rarely burned wood during the middle of the day because the room stayed warm enough without it. Agent Pollard stepped forward, staring at the open floor hatch. He could feel a steady, gentle current of warm air rising from the opening, striking his face and melting the frost that had accumulated on his mustache. The air coming from the floor smelled of dry earth, cedar, and fresh tea. Pollard asked her what was down beneath the floor. Clara stepped back from the hatchway and quietly invited the three men to come down and see for themselves. Thad, Arthur, and Agent Pollard carefully lowered themselves through the wooden hatchway, descending the 7 hand-carved stone steps. As they reached the bottom step, the biting, lethal cold of the Montana winter vanished completely. They stepped out onto the smooth plank floor of a fully furnished, beautifully dry underground bedroom. The transition was so sudden and profound that Arthur Brooks instinctively reached out and grabbed the timber doorframe, trying to make sense of what his senses were telling him. Agent Henry Pollard was a trained man of science, and once his initial shock wore off, his professional instincts took over. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat, which had instantly become uncomfortably hot in the warm room, and pulled a high-precision, calibrated mercury thermometer from his breast pocket. He held the instrument at chest height in the center of the subterranean bedroom. The mercury column climbed rapidly, settling at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked to the far wall, pressing the bulb of the thermometer directly against the clay and straw plaster. It read 66 degrees. He checked the floor level near the raised sleeping platform, 64 degrees. Pollard pulled out his official extension field journal and began writing down the data with rapid, energetic strokes of his pencil. He looked up at Clara and asked her when she had last lit a fire in her small camp stove. Clara replied that she had burned 4 small sticks of pine at 6 o'clock that morning to boil water for tea and had not touched the stove since. Pollard calculated the numbers aloud for the 2 stunned builders standing beside him. Outside surface temperature, 35 degrees below zero. Indoor temperature in Thad Miller's handcrafted log home, 32 degrees, achieved only by burning 3.5 cords of prime larch over 3 weeks and stoking 2 fireplaces every 45 minutes. Indoor temperature in Clara Vance's underground room, 68 degrees, achieved with 0 active fire burning for the past 10 hours, and total monthly fuel consumption of less than 1/3 of a cord. The mathematical reality was indisputable. The combination of 8.5 feet of soil mass, the double-wall clay plaster, the raised floor, and the dead air Quonset airlock overhead had produced an effective insulation value exceeding R120. It was a level of thermal efficiency 4 times greater than the finest double-chinked log home in the territory. Thad Miller walked slowly around the room as Pollard recited the numbers. He touched the smooth clay wall. It felt solid, dry, and faintly warm under his palm. He looked at the raised sleeping platform with its light cotton quilt, then down at his own bandaged, frostbitten fingers. Arthur Brooks knelt near the floor, examining the timber shoring and the perimeter gravel drain. As a master carpenter, he could now see the brilliant structural logic of the entire assembly. The heavy fir posts transferred the weight of the Quonset shell directly to the shale bedrock, meaning the earth walls bore no structural load. The clay plaster managed humidity. The French drain prevented water accumulation, and the upper Quonset hut kept the snow and wind from ever touching the entrance. Arthur looked up at Clara, his face pale, with a mix of awe and profound humility. He admitted quietly that in 30 years of framing homes across the West, he had never seen a structure so perfectly adapted to the realities of a mountain climate. The 3 men stood in the quiet, warm room, surrounded by 80 tons of protective earth, realizing that the woman they had spent 3 months laughing at had quietly built the safest, most scientific, and most comfortable home in the entire Montana territory. For Thaddeus Miller, standing in that quiet, warm room was a moment of profound personal transformation. The pride that had driven him to criticize Clara, the arrogance that had made him assume his wealth and traditional methods made him superior, evaporated entirely in the gentle, 68-degree air of her subterranean sanctuary. He looked at Clara, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. He told her that he had come up the hill expecting to find a tragedy born of ignorance, but instead he had found a masterclass in wisdom. He publicly admitted that he had been completely wrong about her building, and about what it took to survive in this land. He confessed that his pride had blinded him, and he apologized unreservedly for the mockery he had directed at her over the past 3 months. Clara looked at the mill owner, her expression softening. She did not gloat. She did not offer a sharp retort or remind him of the bets he had placed at the general store. She simply told him that cold weather was a demanding teacher and that there was no shame in learning a new lesson from the earth. She offered him a cup of hot tea, which Thad accepted with hands that were shaking not from the cold, but from deep emotion. Word of what the search party had discovered beneath the buried Quonset hut swept through the Flathead Valley like wildfire. Within 48 hours, the perception of Clara Vance transformed completely. She was no longer viewed as an eccentric outsider or a foolish widow playing at homesteading. She was recognized as a woman of extraordinary intellect, practical genius, and quiet courage. As the weather moderated over the following weeks, a steady stream of visitors made their way up to the lot near the tree line. But they did not come to gawk or joke. They came with notebooks, measuring tapes, and deep humility. Thad was the first to ask for her help. He brought his mill foreman up to her property, asking Clara to guide them in designing a subterranean, earth-banked addition for his own family's home before the next winter arrived. Arthur Brooks began modifying his standard cabin blueprints, incorporating deep stone footings, earth-bermed northern walls, and subfloor gravel drainage systems into every new home he framed. Clara shared everything she knew freely. She drew diagrams on scrap lumber, explained the depth calculations for reaching stable ground temperatures, and showed the local men how to mix clay and straw plaster to regulate indoor moisture. She refused to take payment for her advice, telling her neighbors that survival wisdom belonged to the whole community, not to any single person. The town that had once isolated her embraced her fully. She was appointed to the County Agricultural Board, where her insights helped dozens of struggling families design winter storage structures and livestock shelters that drastically reduced animal mortality across the territory. The valley had learned a lesson far larger than building techniques. True strength lies not in stubbornly fighting the forces of nature with brute force and expensive materials, but in having the humility to understand nature's laws and build in harmony with them. Over the decades that followed, the story of Clara Vance's hidden room became a foundational legend of the Flathead Valley. The hybrid technique of combining an upper metal weather shell with a deep, earth-sheltered living chamber spread across Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas, saving countless homesteaders from the brutal freezes of the late 20th century. Clara lived comfortably in her earth-sheltered home for over 35 years, raising garden crops in the warm upper Quonset during the summers and sleeping peacefully in her quiet subterranean bedroom through every winter storm that swept down from the mountains. Her story remains a powerful reminder of a truth that modern home construction often forgets. True efficiency does not come from burning more energy or installing more complex machinery, but from working with the natural systems that the earth has already provided. While modern buildings waste millions of dollars fighting the winter climate from above ground, the quiet wisdom of earth-sheltered design continues to demonstrate that the safest, most stable shelter on the planet is resting right beneath our feet. Where are you watching from today? And would you ever consider building a hidden, earth-sheltered room beneath your own home? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of frontier ingenuity and justice, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more incredible survival history every week. Educational note: this story presents a narrative reconstruction based on historical frontier building principles, thermal mass science, and earth-sheltered architectural practices for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, specific names, and dialogue are dramatized. Modern construction should always adhere to current local building codes, structural engineering standards, and safety guidelines.